So you want to know how Mormonism fits into American history, and further, why knowing Mormonism is important for understanding American history. My name is Benjamin Park. I'm a scholar of American religion and have written several books on Mormon history. I frequently get asked the question, what are your favorite books in Mormon history? Or a related question, what books should I read if I want to know more about Mormon history? Every Friday, I do these so you want to know more about X topics, and some of these have to do with Mormonism and some don't. But I thought for this week, I would dig into a particular variant of that question of what are my favorite books on Mormon history, but to frame it as what are my favorite books about Mormon history that talk about the grander story of American history in general. So I got 6 books for you, 3 from about the 19th century, 3 about the 20th century, that demonstrate that understanding the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is important in order to understand broader contours of the development of the United States. Let's dig in. First, I think it's fair to lay out some criteria for why I chose these books. I wanted books that are well written, are written by experts, are steeped in archival-based research, and are making an argument about the broader American story. Now, half of these authors come from the Latter-day Saint tradition, and half of them don't, which kind of signifies how they bridge these worlds of the academic study of history and religion and the Mormon sphere. If I were to try to address the question of what my favorite books in Mormon history in general are, or the best written books in Mormon history, it might be a slightly different list. But these books, I think, are crucial to demonstrate both for those who know a bit about Mormon history that you need to understand American history in order to contextualize the Mormon faith, but also these books are addressed to people who may not know much about Mormon history, but make the compelling claim that you do need to know about Mormon history in order to understand how America came to be. All right, with all the throat clearing done, let's jump into the books. Let's start with the 19th century, and I want to do a book that talks about the origins of Mormonism, and a recent book that hasn't gotten nearly as much attention as it deserves is Adam Jortner's book, No Place for Saints, Mobs and Mormons in Jacksonian America. This book covers both the origins of Mormonism, digs into the magic circles in which Joseph Smith ran and the translation of the Book of Mormon, all the way through Zion's camp in 1835 when Mormons hoped to retake their Independence, Missouri lands by force. That ended in a debacle. This book places these early conflicts between the Latter-day Saints and their neighbors within the broader context of antebellum America, the Jacksonian period that prioritized majority rule and the creation of these mobs and the prevalence of extra-legal justice. In other words, it not only helps us understand why Mormons were kicked out of Pennsylvania and New York and then forcibly removed out of Missouri by a county-sanctioned mob, but how those episodes of violence can tell us a lot about the broader culture of belonging and democracy in an age that was known for Andrew Jackson, the president of the time. It also digs into the supernatural elements of belief. I really think this is the best brief analysis of Joseph Smith and seer stones and folklore culture and how that fed into these cultural clashes that end up shaping the Mormon tradition. But the topic that Mormons are, of course, best known for in the 19th century is polygamy. So I wanted a book that not just talked about Mormon polygamy, but the legal and political debates over Mormon polygamy. And we get this with Sarah Barringer Gordon's The Mormon Question, Polygamy and Constitutional Conflict in 19th Century America. The author, Sally Gordon, is a phenomenal, one of the leading scholars in American legal history, and she uses these debates over polygamy to better understand the parameters of religious freedom during the 19th century. How did the Republican Party come to envision an energetic and imperial legal order that could not just eradicate slavery in the South, but kill polygamy out in the West? And she talks about the various legislative measures like the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act all the way up to the Edmunds-Tucker Act and how that fit into these broader questions of governance and control during America before and after the Civil War. And of course, there's a lot on the Reynolds v. United States decision in 1877, the Supreme Court case that ruled that the government had the authority to prosecute polygamists and that it was not a violation of religious liberty, defining the boundaries that you might have the freedom to believe what you want, but you don't have the freedom to practice what you want. And that axis for understanding religious freedom in many ways still frames our legal and political structure today. So that's why the Mormon debates over polygamy end up shaping much of America's legal culture. And one final book on the 19th century has to do with race. Paul Reeve's Religion of a Different Color, Race and the Mormon Struggle for Whiteness, published by Oxford University Press, looks at the fascinating dynamic that might surprise many, that Mormons were not considered white in the 19th century. How can that be? They're the quintessential white religion when you think about Donny Osmond and Marie Osmond in the 20th century and the Mormon missionaries pushing out white imperialism across the globe. But that was not the case in the 19th century. Paul Reeve shows that race was a social construct, and that not only was it used to emphasize the uncivilized nature of non-white people, whether it be African Americans or the Chinese or the Native Americans, but it argued because the Mormons weren't acting civilized, because they were practicing polygamy and believing in theocracy, that signified that they had given up their whiteness, which also meant they had forfeited their claims to American belonging and citizenship. Rights and privileges and citizenship was defined in 19th century and through most of the 20th century based on racial principles. And so Mormons being cast as non-white, and this goes into the plethora of evidence, both in political cartoons, and there's lots of great political cartoons in it, but also written and textual evidence of how Americans did not see Mormons as acting like a white civilized community. And then in return, Mormons tried to prove their whiteness in order to gain their place within American culture and society. And one of the ways they did that was punishing those on the margins. So they implemented the racial restriction that barred those with African descent from priesthood and temple ordinances. They marginalized those of Indigenous American, not welcoming full and fulfilling their vision of them being children of God. In other words, this is a history not just of how Mormons were racialized, but how Mormons racialized others, and how that framework laid the foundations for much of how Mormonism has operated ever since. Now let's move to the 20th century, where truly some of the best and most innovative work has taken place in the recent decades, showing that Mormonism is fascinating beyond just Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. So the first question is, how does Mormonism move from the pariahs of American culture to the embodiment of mainstream Americanness? Well, the origins are found in the first decade of the 20th century. And Kathleen Flake, in her book, The Politics of American Religious Identity, the seating of Senator Reed Smoot, a Mormon apostle, is a fascinating micro history. I might do a whole video at some point on the Reed Smoot trial, but he was a Mormon apostle who was elected to the US Senate, and then there was a debate about whether the Senate would allow a Mormon apostle in their midst. And it started a several-year-long national attention based around these congressional hearings of Reed Smoot that were not just about whether Reed Smoot was acceptable, but whether Mormons were an acceptable religion. Were Mormons still practicing polygamy? Were Mormons willing to embrace pluralism and democracy? This is a time that Mormons further distance themselves from their polygamous past, including issuing the Second Manifesto, which was basically in 1904 saying, we really mean it this time that we're giving up polygamy. I've done a video on the ends of polygamy before, if you can go back and watch it. It also gets into the political transformation of America this time. One of my favorite lines in the entire book is when Kathleen Flake, who is a specialist in religious history and one of the great scholars of Mormon studies, she argues that for Mormons to finally be accepted as American, they had to start acting more like a church rather than an empire. And the nation, the American government, had to stop acting like a church and more like a nation. That it was that compromise that was the heart of what allowed Mormons to finally be considered, laying the groundwork for Mormons becoming the uber Americans, which are typically seen today. Another legacy of polygamy question here is, how do Mormon women fit into this broader story of the 20th century? Colleen McDannell published a book, Sister Saints, Mormon Women Since the End of Polygamy, which is on its surface a history of how women have operated within the LDS tradition from 1890 to the present. But it's even more nuance than that. It's more layered because it's looking into questions of belief and belonging and power and gender and traditional marital roles. How have women operated not just within Mormonism, but within capitalism, within America, within the new pluralistic age? And this is a fascinating story of not just how, like, the Relief Society and Mormon women leaders have operated within this world and have crafted and reaffirmed a retrenched traditional gender framework within Mormonism, but how those debates fit within wider American questions of gender equality, especially in the wake of second wave feminism and the last few decades, and how have women claimed space in these religious traditions. And now that we're living in an age where women have a declining presence or commitment to religious traditions, this book helps us understand how we got here, not just within Mormonism, but within the broader world. And then moving into the 21st century, although there's a lot of this in the 20th century, is questions over sexuality, not just gender. And Taylor Petrey's Tabernacles of Clay, Sexuality and Gender in Modern Mormonism looks at how Mormons have constructed traditional gender ideas since World War II, including gender attraction. This is the creation of the Mormon doctrine and practice of homosexuality, which you might think has always been the case, but he shows how modern those boundaries have been created. And he looks at this fascinating dynamic that Mormons always emphasize, that gender is eternal, that it's unchanging, that it can't be adapted. That's the problem with modern day sexuality studies. But Taylor argues, convincingly I think, that if gender was so eternal, it would not always be as at risk as it appears. In other words, it's because those gender boundaries are so fluid that LDS leaders have been so anxious to reaffirm them. This is a fascinating episode of not just understanding Mormon sexuality, but how American religions in general have confronted. We see the Baptists, we see the Catholics also confronting gender, sexuality, and fluidity and attraction in a way that makes us understand the modern day partisan lines that divide society and divide many religious congregations, including Mormonism. So there you have it. Those are my 6 books that I recommend reading if you want to understand how Mormonism fits into American history and how you have to understand that Mormon piece of the puzzle to understand and fully see the broader picture of American society. If you were to ask me this question again in a couple of weeks, I might have a different list, but these are 6 phenomenal books. And if there are specific topics that you would like me to see dig into those books, please let me know in the comments. Also, if there are books you think I missed that you really enjoy that talk about Mormon history within the context of American history, please leave those comments as well. I hope you found this video interesting. Please like and share it with others so more people can experience these wonderful, wonderful books. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet. History has never been more relevant than it is right now, which is why these books, these scholarship, these discussions are so important.